Hey everybody. So I talk about movies a lot on this channel because that's just what I like. I like stories, I like to be a storyteller. I think that stories are a natural human expression and the best way that we've kept record throughout history and stuff like that. But I've mostly stuck away from music, and that's for the same reason I just mentioned. I like stories. So normally, music isn't as involved with stories as a straightforward film or short story or something like that. However, with what I'm talking about today, there is one exception. If you are not familiar with this album personally, you are going to think I'm absolutely crazy when I say this. But I believe one of the best stories ever told through song form is that of My Chemical Romance's Welcome to the Black Parade. To understand where I'm coming from this, you have to know the background of the album itself. It was written as a concept album. In other words, the entire album is telling one particular story, or at least sticking with one particular theme. This went so much so to the point that My Chemical Romance didn't even go by MCR during their tour for it. They simply went by The Black Parade, which was essentially an alter ego of these paraders who guided others to death. A lot of people applied the band's other work, which is what would be considered the emo genre, so to speak, even though the lead singer would absolutely disagree. But this album is entirely separate from any other work the band's put out and is something rarely seen in music. When asked about his inspiration for the album, Gerard Way said that he looked to Freddie Mercury, and that cannot be closer to the truth. The album is, by and large, a definitive rock opera. What I mean by that is rock music and chords are used to tell a grandiose story in a very epic nature. The reason rock opera is the term used for it is because it harkens back to the old epic plays that were put on by Homer and the Odyssey and things such as during Greek opera days. That goes so far that many of the songs are ballads or anthems for our main character, and as we'll get into, it's as if there is a choir or opera that is backing him up in the story. But we'll get into all that in a minute. Now, I am not the first person to think of this. There have been several who have looked at the entire album, listened through tracks 1 through 13, and figured out a story that works in those. However, I disagree. Where I'm coming from with this is that when I first listened to this album, I had this very clear picture in my head of what the story was supposed to be, and every time I listened to it, it just strengthened that. Could this be my own wild delusions? Yes. Am I going to learn from them? No. I believe one of the main hangups people have with the album is that they assume all of the songs have to be chronological, and this is not the case. According to my theory, the songs are told out of order for a reason I will get to at the end, which put together a grandiose, full 3-act story structure about a dying cancer patient. As I go through, I'm going to talk about my interpretation of the story, what it means, give you the track list in order in the way that I think the story plays out, and then at the end I'm going to try to put it all together and justify why I consider this album one of, if not the greatest of all time. At least you know, my opinion. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And what better place to start than the end? Now come all to this tragic affair. The album is gentle in the beginning, as the first 2 tracks, according to my theory at least, are in chronological order with the way the story's told. So if this album is harkening back to old operas and playwrights of these epic storytelling adventures, then what better way to start than a call to theater? Not only is the story's plot set up where we hear the beeping heart rate monitor implying someone in a hospital and at death's door, we also see thematic elements set up in the way that the lead character is talking and pompous with his nature. Now, something I want to explain now because it's going to be a big deal later. There are 2 characters who sing throughout this album. They're both done by Gerard Way, but this album is a story told on 2 different sides. One side is that of a dying cancer patient in the hospital. The other is that of death, or a wayward soul, or some spirit who's come to guide the cancer patient to the other side. Not only that, but death itself works as a sort of backup choir for our cancer patient. When I say death, I want you to think of this. There are several legends in old religions and things such as that foretell that lost souls who get trapped on Earth are forced to guide other souls on to the afterlife. I'll get into later why this death isn't necessarily the Grim Reaper, and it's just another wayward soul. The way to tell who is singing what song is by the opening. If a song starts out with acoustic or simple chords, then it is one of the patient songs. If it starts out with metal or parade instrumentals, then it is one of Death's songs. With my timeline of events, it plays out that every time the patient has a song, Death has a song immediately after, either critiquing or backing up what the patient just said. Also, to be more specific, and again, this will be shown later, but instead of calling him Death, I'm going to call him the Parader. So, back to this first track. We have the patient opening talking about his lot in life and the fact that he is now dying.
Now come on to this tragic affair.
As he's telling this sort of sad story about what happens, immediately it's as if Death comes in and cuts him off literally mid-chorus to announce his presence and make this bombastic entrance. This is what I mean by songs starting out acoustically versus songs starting out metallic. So in Dead, the second track on the album, we have the Parader's introduction, and we get to see what his character's like. Very crude, crass, and completely uncaring to the thought of death. Which, yeah, if your place was to guide souls to the afterlife and you've been doing it a while, I imagine you would lose some respect for life. So much so that in the final chorus, the Parader continues repeating the phrase, "If life ain't just a joke, then why are we laughing?" So in our opening, we have our character set up. We have our patient who's dying, and we have the Parader who is either going to take him to the afterlife or mock until he gets there. This is all set up for the first act of the story. For those aren't familiar with traditional 3-act structure, which was structure followed by opera, the first act of the story is always the setup. It's where we meet the characters, figure out the trial, and then go from there. After that, our second act is conflict. This is normally where characters get into fights with each other and interact, and the main action of the story takes place. Finally, our third act is the resolution, where our character overcomes a conflict either through changing themselves or besting the villain or whatever the story entails. So keep in mind, while we're in the setup story, let's get some more background on the patient, which leads to the third track in order, Teenagers.
They're gonna clean up your looks with all the lies in the books to make a citizen out of you.
Now, this one's kind of cheating with the whole if the song starts out acoustic, but my excuse for it is this song is definitely not the Parader because none of it makes sense from the Parader's perspective. And if you look at where the patient's at now, it makes sense he would have lost some of his vigor or at least angst from where he used to be. So by this timeline, Teenagers is a song to set up the life of the patient. We can immediately tell that the patient is very hateful and violent, and does not at all sound like someone who is dying in a hospital because he's not yet. We're immediately painted the picture of a very hateful and violent young man. Well, I think he's a little bit older than your stereotypical teenager, maybe 18 or 19, since he's kind of talking about teenagers in the past. I'm going to say the attitude of the song and the way he's telling it still feel very adolescent. So if he is 20 or in his 20s, I wouldn't put him much over it. So we have a song from our patient. And to set up the cycle that we're going to continue to be in, the Parader then comes in to make his comment on it. In the fourth song in order, the Sharpest Lives.
Well, it rains and it pours when you're out on your own. If I crash on the couch, can I sleep in my clothes?
Essentially in this song, the Parader is talking about how dangerous some people live their lives, how they're reckless, don't appreciate it, and how it eventually leads to destruction. It also kind of paints this picture that the patient deserves what he's going through, at least because of the hateful attitude of the Parader in the song. Now, while the patient may not necessarily deserve it, that doesn't mean he's exactly a great soul either. Especially with stuff we'll see later in the album like Sleep, but we'll get to that. So, this is the end of the first act, and we have our patient who's dying and used to be kind of a jerk, and Death, who doesn't care, and after hearing how he used to be, he still doesn't care. If anything, he doesn't care even harder. But then we get into a major tone shift. This leads to the 5th track in the album, where the patient realizes what's happening to him and begins to realize the consequences of his actions, and that is cancer. Cancer would have to be the saddest song on the album, as it's just a very honest personal look at someone dying of cancer. And while lines like this may seem kind of cliche by today's standards,
"'Cause the hardest part of this is leaving you."
when put in the perspective of a young man who is dying too soon of something that wasn't really in his control, it's kind of made more relevant. We are not to the patient's point of acceptance yet, but here at the beginning of the 2nd act, we see the conflict arising. The patient came from a very hateful, argumentative place, and now he's got to face the reality of death, something that most people aren't ready for, especially a kid. We see this very somber tone come out of him, which is nothing at all like how he was in teenagers. However, what does this attitude change mean to a reaper of death who's been guiding dead souls for a long time? Not a lot, as the next song in the list is House of Wolves. We see here Death acting exactly how you'd imagine a pompous parader, Death rock opera leader to act. He's very mocking and back and forth, and one of the core concepts of this song is he's talking about judgment. And when it comes to dying, we all know what that means. He goes back and forth talking about being a good boy, being a bad boy, and so on and so on. He even gets to the point where he's marking religious overtones and sayings, showing a complete disregard for life, sanctity, and all of that.
You play ring around the ambulance like you never gave a care. So get the choir boys around you, it's a compliment, I swear. And I said ashes to ashes, we all fall down. I wanna hear you sing the praise. I said ashes to ashes, we all fall down. We got innocence for days.
Even saying the letters S-I-N over and over, implying that because of the patient's life, just because he's sad now and dying of cancer, it won't save him from damnation. Now, it's my opinion that at this point, the patient cannot hear or understand death yet, and it's sort of like death is just his backup. Best example I can think of, if you've ever seen the Disney animated movie Hercules, how the, what were they called? The animated cartoon? Whoever they were, how they were singing in chorus behind Hercules anytime he did something. That's essentially what death is at this point, or the parader. Only, you know, a lot more swearing and blood and heavy metal, so all good. However, on the patient side, we're still in this conflict, and then we see an absolutely heartbreaking turn of events with the 7th track in order, I Don't Love You. It seems like what happened here is the patient's lover left him because he was dying of cancer. And that brings up this absolutely horrible idea. If these people are just kids, then what kind of emotional burden is that to put on the spouse or girlfriend or whoever he had with him to now watch someone that young die of cancer, but at the same time, what a burden that is on him in his final moments to be left alone. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And while the band normally gets considered emo, I would say this is the only track on the entire album that could fit that description. However, it is so poetic that the only emo track on the album is a teenager who is dying and their lover leaves them. And there's this absolute hatred that the patient has when talking about this person.
When you go, would you have the guts to say, I don't love you like I loved you yesterday?
But again, it seems justified given the context. So again, patient says something, Death has to comment on it. So what's Death's comment on I Don't Love You? This is how I disappear. In the song, Death is talking about the patient dying alone with no one there to be with them. But not only that, Death also seems to mock the patient with the way he treated people in life. This, I think, more than anything, kind of personifies the whole opera theme I was talking about, where the patient directly talks about something, and then it's like Death or the parader is standing behind them with this grandiose, bombastic music and orchestra to emphasize what they just said. However, what I think is very important about How I Disappear, especially in the whole tone of the album, is the last verse. See, up until this point, there has been this complete charisma and charm to the parader, as if nothing could touch him. But here, when the instruments drop down and it becomes more hellish with the tone, it's like the parader is screaming and starting to lose it. And here, I think, is the first signs of the parader cracking. He sees someone who's young, dying alone, and it starts to get to him. Now you may ask yourself, why would that get to Death? He's done this how many times? Why am I watching this video? Who is this guy? And I can answer one of those, but in a second. So we end the 8th track with Death starting to break, and we see some cracks shining through about how he feels about the patient. Well, how does the patient feel? And this is where we get into what is, in my opinion, the most underrated track on the album. If the entire album is about redemption and about a dying kid recognizing that that's okay and him making the most of it, then this song is that pivot. Everything that came before was either pompous or sad self-reflection, but this is the direction he turns and begins to recognize that he's dying and that's okay. And that song is Disenchanted. Disenchanted is not only powerful for some of the lyrics it speaks that have stuck with me to this day, but with the theme of this patient, it makes sense. He was a kid, he didn't appreciate life like so many others have, but then he gets slapped with reality all at once. And then the person he loves leaves him, and now he's completely alone. And this whole life thing that he was so big about and ready to go for is falling apart around him, and he's simply disenchanted with it all. While it is sad, especially considering that this kid even has to go through it in the first place, there's this odd peace he gets from it. As he says in the beginning, he hates the ending, but it started with an alright scene. He's now in a time of self-reflection and recognizes that he can't do anything about it, but that's okay. It's happening anyway, and he'll be here for it when it comes. So after one of the most somber tracks on the album, that also signifies the end of the second act, because that was the end of our conflict. The patient dying and going through all of this and not knowing how to take it, well, now he knows how to take it. So what's our resolution going to be? Because we still have the parader as mad and upset as he's ever been, especially at the end of How I Disappear. Well, the parader opens the third act with his backstory, which might possibly be the best song on the entire album, Mama.
Mama, we all go to hell.
So people who try to take the entire album chronologically and make it all a metaphor for death struggle on a lot of songs, specifically teenagers in this one. They say that, oh, well, this is him dying, he's already dead and he's talking to a character named Mama, and I don't like any of that. I like this. If Death or the parader is a wayward soul that at some point in the past became lost. Then this is the story of how he became a lost soul. We're immediately in the beginning given these old sounds of accordions and bombs falling, which immediately paint the picture of a soldier in the Great War. It talks about writing letters, about how he's soon going to die, but not only that, there's alliteration to World War I throughout the entire song.
Well, mother was the war did to my legs and to my tongue. You should have raised a baby girl. I should have been a better son. If you could count on the infection, naked, amputated ones, you should have been. I could have been a better son.
As well as the sonograph and voice played at the end, so it was without a doubt in my mind that this song is set in World War I. Well, you could ask yourself, if you don't know this story, why would it randomly cut to a song in the past? Because this is the backstory for the Parader, and this is also the reason the Parader has sympathy for the patient. The Parader was a soldier in World War I, and as we can hear in the verses, he's mad, he's upset, he hates himself, and what happens? We hear air raid sirens take over the instrumentals. We hear him crying out for his mom. Before silence falls, we hear his mother speaking.
And if you would call me your sweetheart, I'd maybe then sing you a song.
And then we hear him rise back up.
But the shit that I've done with this record, you would cry out to rise on.
He's then followed by an orchestra, supposedly the field of corpses around him, of other lost souls, all singing in unison about being damned together. And then finally, the song closes with the strings playing as the Parader's mother cries at his loss. I also want to point out, I've been talking a lot about the plot of it, and that's what I want this video to be focused on, but I also want to mention how good this music is. Like, for example, this song in particular uses air raid sirens and heavy metal instrumentals as a chorus to talk about a soldier dying in battle, and then uses a choir of these supposed corpses on the battlefield to sing about dying in a war, and it's top tier. Like, if you get nothing else out of this video, if you think I am absolutely wrong about everything and you haven't heard it yet, then I beg you, go listen to the album and then come back and tell me how wrong and stupid I am. I just listen to the album. But back on topic for Mama. This is the Parader's version of teenagers. This is our look into what these characters were like beforehand. Whereas the patient was pompous and silly and ended up dying alone, quite possibly due to the way he treated people in life, we see here that the Parader himself also died alone on a battlefield as a war as another statistic. This not only justifies the earlier songs in the album where the Parader was super pompous and didn't care about death and seemed to hate everything, but it also justifies his change of heart now. Which, we haven't seen that change of heart yet, but we're about to really soon. The next song we have in track order is Sleep. So speaking of resolution, this is the beginning of our third act resolution between the patient and the Parader. Sleep is essentially the patient coming off of the mood that he earned in Disenchanted and talking about how now it's time to die and that's okay, and he's done a lot of wrong, which is further backs up my point that he's dying alone because of his actions and he doesn't feel like he's worthy of heaven. At the end of the song, we hear the patient about to slip away into death. But if you listen real close, and I mean really close, behind that wall of instrumentals, you can hear the Parader screaming at him to wake up. Now, not only is this a massive change of pace for the Parader, as the last time we heard him talking to the patient in How I Disappear was very angry and against him, we now see the Parader begging him to hold on, which apparently works, as the next track in order is the two of them having this argument, and that song is Famous Last Words.
No, I know that I can make you stay, but where's your heart?
Famous Last Words opens with the Parader side of the discussion, and the chorus is the two of them arguing, which begins with the patient making his point.
I am not afraid to keep on living. I am not afraid to walk this world alone. If you stay, I'll be forgiven. Nothing you can say can stop me going home.
We see this going back and forth in a sort of dualism when the patient's explaining why he's not afraid to die and the Parader explaining why he has to fight it. It's also kind of sad if you think of the Parader as this lost kid who died in a completely senseless way, just like the patient's now dying. It's kind of like he's pushing the patient to fight because he himself never could. Also, going back to that concept of judgment earlier, Famous Last Words appears as the 13th track on the original album. There are two endings to the song Famous Last Words. There is the album version, which ends with a choir singing, and then there's the radio version that ends with heavy metal guitars. The common interpretation of this is that the choir rendition ending means that the patient goes to heaven, and the metal ending means that the patient goes to hell. I also agree with this, but whereas most people view that as the end of the album and woohoo, bye, the patient's gone, I view it as the judgment that happens before the actual death. Because remember, in my idea, the patient's not dead till the very end. And also because the album version, which is where this originally happened and the story comes, ends with the choir version, I'm going to say the patient made it. Because of his recompense, because of his realization, and because of his self-betterment, in the end, the patient made it into heaven. Or at least passed into the afterlife, or whatever positive outcome you want to view this story with. So, where are we? We're 12 tracks in. The patient has gone from absolutely hateful and angry at everything, to sadness, to realizing his situation and coming to comfort with it. And the Parader himself has gone from this hateful, non-caring attitude towards human life to recognizing the similarities between the patient and himself, and then coming to terms with the patient's resolve. So it doesn't seem like there's a lot left to do than throw him a parade. Welcome to the Black Parade is the final song in the story of this album and the send-off to our main character. Also, I think this is absolutely beautiful from a story perspective. The reason that the Parader appeared to him as a Parader and not the soldier he originally was or some other omen of death is, as the patient mentions in the beginning of the song.
When I was a young boy, my father took me into the city to see a marching band.
He always viewed his father, even though supposedly his father died when he was young, possibly of the same illness, as this sort of mythical figure that always taught him to do good and carry on. So in these final moments, in these final thoughts, he sees death come to him as that vision of good and justice that he always imagined, the parade leader marching on. So this is it, his final moments, and he's at peace with that. Now it's his time to go join the Black Parade. But this time, and this is something really important a lot of people miss out on, what is it the parade's singing? They're singing his song. Instead of it being the Parader trying to tell his story and scream over the voice of the patient, he now respects the patient as, if not himself, then an equal. When the patient's final moments of their dying on the hospital bed, The parader uses all of his people, all of his resources, his strings, his brass, all of it, to sing the patient song as he's carried into the afterlife. And then finally, we get that end ballad, which begins with the parader mentioning his mama from the beforehand song, and then talking about how we'll carry on, we'll always have the memory of those who go before us. And then in the end, as seen in the music video, we see the parader grant respect to this patient as he walks off into no man's land. A worthy soldier is in him. And that's it. That's the story of the Black Parade. I mentioned earlier that there is a specific reason that all of these were told out of order, and it's this. Every single song on the album works in complete separation from the album. Any of them. Teenagers is an excellent ballad for teenage rebellion. House of Wolves can be translated as a song from running from the law or just like a carefree spirit. I Don't Love You can be a breakup song that applies to anyone. Dead sounds like a fighter's ballad, the whole dead already ideology. And Mama's just cool. It is my opinion that if the album was told in order, then every song would exist within the concept of the story already. Instead, people love the Black Parade because they just love the songs, which is exactly what music should be. You can go up to people who have never heard another My Chemical Romance song in their life and begin playing Teenagers, and they'll know the words and get along with it because they like it. They don't know or care about the story, and they shouldn't have to. When I talked about the horror of imagination in the Lighthouse video I did, I mentioned how much more powerful stories are when you come to the realization yourself. And I can't think of a place that's more true than this album. It's not all laid out in front of you, and that's the fun part. I listened to this album through for the first time in the 8th grade, and I distinctly remember when I finished Famous Last Words thinking, there's something bigger here that I'm not getting. And over the years, after listening to it over and over, this story started to take shape. And at one point, I just sat back and realized every one of these songs that I've come to love so much, that I've learned the words to, that I've sang with friends, are all part of a grander story. And when I came to that realization myself, because of the clues left for me by the writer and the drums and the music and all of it, it was so much more powerful than just an A to Z story. Now, did me making this video and telling you all what the track order was, keeping you from figuring it out for yourself? Yeah, but, you know, the album's been out, what, like 12 years now, so spoiler alert. My Chemical Romance's The Black Parade was such a great introduction for me into the realm of telling your own story. Not only do I love the plot and ideas put forward, and I love every song on their own merit, and I think they come together in this beautiful mosaic of an album, but I can definitively say the lessons that I learned, figuring it out, listening to it over and over, were crucial in teaching me to be the storyteller that I'm still trying to become to this day. So I know they'll never see this. I've got less than 1,000 subscribers, highest viewed videos like 500. I'm just playing. But thank you, Gerard Way and Frankie and everyone else who had to do with the writing of this album, because I can definitively say that if I did not listen to it then, I wouldn't be where I am now. Also, there are 2 tracks that are sort of bonus tracks, one of which was added in the deluxe edition of the album as a hidden track, Blood, and then one that was on the B-side, which is essentially like songs that didn't make the cut, called Kill All Your Friends. As much as I like them, I get why they were cut. It kind of breaks up that whole 3-act structure I was talking about, and it makes it a bit more bloated in the first act. However, super quick, Blood is the patient's point of view when he's still snarky and hateful, talking about how he doesn't like the nurses and all that. And Kill All Your Friends is the parader mocking him by saying he's going to die and everyone's going to party about it. So you could just throw those in after the Sharpest Lives before Cancer, before he had that turnaround. I personally don't consider it as much as I like Kill All Your Friends, but if you wanted to, there you go. So here is your final full list for all of the songs. I may have to, I don't know where it's going to be at, I guess here. 1 through 13 with your 2 bonus tracks shoved in there. So if you want to listen to it in your own time, See if I'm wrong, see if you can figure out the story yourself, or listen to it in the version it is in the album. See if you think it's different. Some of these in the middle, I could be persuaded to flip around, but I am ready to fight someone about the rest of the tracks, and I will absolutely fight you. So if you think you've got a better idea, please let me know. As always, I want to give a massive shout out to all of my patrons. I, with no exaggeration, would not be doing any of this if it wasn't for you all, and it really does mean a lot. So our patrons of Warden tier, we've got Eddie Shoemaker, thank you Eddie. Kayla Garrett, thank you Kayla. We've got Peth, my boy, thank you. We've got Benjamin Allen, the GOAT, thank you Benjamin. We've got Tim Freelove, an absolute legend as well. And we've got Publius Rex, who, you know you have my heart. Thank you to all my other patrons of Stag and every other tier. It really does mean a lot. This was something entirely different. This is probably going to be the hardest to edit video I've ever done. I am dreading it right now. But really, if you are still here watching, thank you. It means the world. I ask that you like, comment, share, whatever. I would love for this to make the rounds, as I'm knowing now I'm going to have to put work into it. But something that's this special to me, I think deserves this amount of attention. So whatever, I'm happy to do it. Again, thank you guys so much for watching. It really does mean the world. And without further ado, peace out and thank you, boys. Bye.